We live in a world with so many different organisms, so many different creatures, and a long time ago, there was this guy who just sat there and thought, okay, it's getting too chaotic. I've seen too many organisms. I gotta find a way to organize and classify them into nice organized groups so it makes more sense what's going on here. So, this brings us to the topic of classification of biodiversity. Classification just means to organize, to group, to put in a logical manner. And biodiversity means life, living things. Bio means living things. Okay, so classifying all this diversity of living things, classification of biodiversity. Now, this guy I'm talking about, his name is Aristotle. So he's done a bunch of things, and maybe you've heard of him. Now, he existed so long ago, so long ago. So he didn't know anything about evolution or science or anything like this. So put yourself in his shoes. If you were asked to group all living things on Earth, how would you do it? So what he did was, he essentially took all living things on Earth, all living organisms, and thought that, okay, I see these ones, these animal-like things that move, they move, and then there's these other green things that grow and stuff, but they don't move around. So I'm going to make these two categories. And he called it plants and animals, right? Now, I would do this too, to be honest, if I lived that long ago and didn't know anything about science. So it's not stupid to do this. But you'll see why there's some problems with it. Because the next step he did was, he was like, okay, so I'm going to write down all the animals I find. So he's going to be like, okay, animals. He's going to write down lion, giraffe, elephant, and then continuously write down the whole list. It's of many creatures, and the same with plants. Now, why is this a problem? The problem with his method is that plants and animals aren't the only things on Earth. What about bacteria? Bacteria is neither a plant or an animal, right? So how do we classify it? So his problem was he didn't make enough big categories, okay? Because there aren't only plants and animals. There could be other things like bacteria, right? So that was his first problem. Now the second problem was this, okay? Like I said, if we consider animals, he basically wrote down the whole list. Human, ape, elephant, so on, right? But we know that's not how it works. Humans don't just appear out of nowhere and he writes them down. Apes don't just appear out of nowhere and now he adds them to the list. An elephant doesn't appear out of nowhere and then he adds it to the list, right? There's a whole process of evolution. Like apes, for example, humans didn't appear out of nowhere. They came after the apes. They came specifically from the apes, right? Through evolution. But he didn't know about evolution, so he didn't know this. But in reality, a better way to have made this diagram would have been to do something like this, right? Have the ape and know that, oh, okay, a human comes from an ape. Okay, and then, okay, where does the ape come from? And then have another organism, right? It should be more of a complex diagram showing one organism evolving into another and so on, right? It's not as simple as the way he made it seem. But that's not his fault. He didn't know anything about science or evolution. It didn't exist back then, okay? So that's why his method was not as good. But, no, not to worry. He was the first stepping stone, okay? Because the next guy who came along, his name was Carolus Linnaeus. Look at these Lamborghinis. We're going to talk about them real soon, so stay tuned. Anyways, this guy, he came next, and he essentially fired this guy. But not really, because this guy died. And later on, this guy was born, and he was looking at what Aristotle did, and he was like, He was noticing these problems that I told you about, and he was like, I can find a better way, okay? Because I learned about evolution and science, and I know more. So what he did was, he was the founder of taxonomy. He was a guy who invented the science of identifying, naming, and grouping organisms. We call that taxonomy. It's not the process of paying tax on your bills or whatever, okay? That's not what it is. And so he invented this type of science, all right? He basically did the same thing as Aristotle, just better. Now, what exactly did he do? Let me show you exactly what he did. I'm going to use these Lamborghinis. If I ask you to point at a machine, what would you point at? You would point at all three of them because they're all machines. So I didn't specify any of them, right? So I gave you a really broad name there. I gave you a really broad name. What if I say, point at the car? What would you do? You would point at all of them because they're all cars. So a machine was very broad. A car was more specific, but you still pointed at all three. Let's go more specific. If I say Lamborghini, what about now? Now, well, that was a more specific name, but still, they're all Lamborghinis, so I point at all of them. So I'm getting more specific, right? Now, what if I say point at the Lamborghini Aventador? Now, you would point at this car if you knew anything about Lamborghinis. But it doesn't matter because this concept I'm using applies to anything like phones or computers or whatever. So I had to give you a specific name enough to be able for you to know what organism or what car I'm talking about, right? And again, if I say now Lamborghini Hurricane, you would point at this one. And then Lamborghini Urus, you would point at this one, right? So you can see we needed two names here, Lamborghini Aventador. Lamborghini wasn't enough, car wasn't enough, right? So we're gonna call this, the Lamborghini is the brand name, right? A Lamborghini can refer to many cars, but this model name means specifically this car, right? So this is kind of what he did. He invented a theory called the binomial system of classification. Binomial, bi means two, right? So for example, bicycle, two wheels, or bipolar if you have two different personalities. And then nomial means name. So he invented this two name system of classification, just like these Lamborghinis. You have to give them two names, Lamborghini Aventador. The first name is broad or general, and the second part to the name is more specific, which allows you to know exactly what organism or what car it is, okay? So this is, you need to know that this guy invented this binomial system of classification, which is the system we use now to name everything, all the living organisms or biodiversity on Earth. So let's move on to using a more real example of real biodiversity. So here we have, same guy, of course, okay? Same information here. So if I say point at the animal, which one do you point at? Again, you don't know because they're both animals, so both of them. If I say point at the bear, again, you point at both of them. So if I say the grizzly bear, then you point at this one, the American grizzly bear. If I say the polar bear, then you point at this one, right? So again, in order to name something, you have to be specific. There's different specificities of naming something. So we call this one the American grizzly bear. But you need to understand that scientists don't call it that, okay? Because in science, taxonomy names these things based on Latin. Why Latin? Because we have so many places on Earth, so many countries, so many languages. If everybody fought over what language we had to use, it would be chaos. Because in English, we call it an American grizzly bear. In Afrikaans or in French, we call it something else, right? So there are many different languages that you can name these things in. So scientists use Latin because it is universal. It is universal, and it makes that there's no language barrier. So all scientists need to use Latin, okay? That way they can always communicate, and we can always give official names in Latin so that everything is clear between scientists, okay? So instead of calling it an American grizzly bear, the real name would be Ursus Americanus. Ursus is a general name, Americanus is specific. Ursus kind of means like bear, okay? Because if we look at the polar bear's name, we would say it's called Ursus maritimus. So if I just said point at the bear or the Ursus, you wouldn't know because that's the general name for this kind of organism. But the second name, Americanus and maritimus, is the more specific name, okay? That one tells us what it is. It's very similar to this Lamborghini idea once again. So we give this more general name, we call it the genus. And we give the second, that's more specific, the species. Okay? Again, genus, species. Genus, you can remember as being more general, and species as being more specific. Just like this. Let me show you here. Genus versus species. Genus is general, species is specific. Okay? So both of these bears have the same genus, but they have different species. Okay? So let's define quickly genus and species. A genus, by the way, you don't need to memorize these definitions for this chapter specifically. It's just useful to know what it is because it makes it more clear. So genus is the part of the name, this binomial system of classification, that indicates a group of species that are very closely related, right? So Ursus is the name we give to all bear-like species, okay? It's the common ancestor, so to speak, okay? And species is the very specific name, okay? And we know to be a species, you need, I'm not going to go into this. This is part of the specific definition of species. You can read it here. I'll explain in the chapter that it needs to be explained in. It's not very important for this one. Just know that species is just a very specific name. Like Homo sapiens, we're a species. In order to be a species, you need to be able to reproduce with that organism and make a kid that can have a kid. So humans can have kids with each other, and their kids will be able to have kids. But if a human has a kid with another thing, like let's say a goat, then if we can make a kid, that kid will not be able to have a kid. So therefore, humans and goats are not the same species. Okay, do you understand vaguely what I mean there? Okay, it's not that important to understand for now, like I said. But okay, let's keep moving. Oh yeah, so here I have a diagram basically that shows just some more names based on the previous image. A lion, they call Pantero Leo. So again, this is genus, this is species. Oh yeah, one thing I almost forgot. Notice that the genus always starts with a capital letter, whereas the species always starts with lowercase letter. That's always true. And we always write it in italics, or what do you call it, like slanted, okay? That's just the standard method. Okay, and again, here's some other organisms. Giraffe, called Giraffa camelopardalis. African elephant, Loxodonto africana. Okay, that's just some more examples for you. So now we gotta move on a little bit to the last important part, the last part of this intro. So we so far talked about genus and species. So coming back to this Lamborghini, this will make it make sense. If this is the species and this is the genus, can we be more broad? Can we have a name even more broad than Lamborghini? Yes, right? Remember, when I was asking in the beginning, I said point at the car. A car is even more broad than Lamborghini because it's not even referring to a type of car. So just like that, we can be even more broad because we talked about species, the most specific, then genus. We can be even more broad and go family. That's even more broad. Just like with the Lamborghini, how I was saying car is even more broad. Then we can go even more broad. For example, for the Lamborghini's sake, it'd be like, let's say machine, okay, machine. That would be even more broad, and then more broad, and more broad. So this naming, this method of naming, let me move this out of the way. They've come to this 8 subset way of naming, all the way from domain down to species. Domain being the most general name possible for an organism, down to its very specific name, okay? And just think back again to this idea of this Lamborghini. We can go from machine to car to Lamborghini to Aventador, okay, from general to specific. That's the same thing we do with organisms, okay? So I'll give you an example just now. First of all, how do we remember this order? So domain being the most general, all the way down to species. So you need to remember this order because basically on the multiple choice test, they can ask you to list the order of the naming, okay, the order of the classification of biodiversity. Okay, so you need to remember the name. So I have a way here. D for domain, K for kingdom, P for phylum, so on. Dear Kevin, please come over for this. Okay, you can read that. If you don't like that, if you're sensitive to that, you can say, Dear Kevin, please come over for good soup. Okay, whatever you like. And there's many other ones that you can find on the internet. Okay, I just find this one pretty easy to remember. So this can help you remember these names a bit easier. So for the IB, okay, we're only going to really go into detail on the first 3. Okay, these other ones become too specific and too many names and too many different, there's way too many classes, way too many orders, way too many families, way too many genus, and millions of species. Okay, so it's too much going on here. So we're only going to focus on these first 3 and explain really some details that you need to know for your test. Okay, but I will talk specifically about domain and kingdom in the next video, and then phylum in the video after that, because that's all we need to know. But for now, the intro, to make it make sense, all the organisms on Earth, remember, we talked about this guy, Aristotle. He said they should be grouped into 2 categories, plants and animals. But he was a bit wrong, right? So meanwhile, this guy changed it. And now we group them all into 3 categories. We call these 3 categories domain. Okay, there are 3 domains, 3 basic groups. Okay, and then these 3 domains can be grouped into 6 kingdoms. And these 6 kingdoms can be grouped into many different phylums. And these phylums can be grouped into many classes, and so on and so on and so on, until we have millions and millions of creatures, millions of species, okay? So it starts from very broad categories to more specific and more specific and more specific, okay? So I'm going to show you here some examples. So here we have, okay, 4 organisms. Let's use this bear. So if we look at the most general name, okay, we're going to look at the first one. So the domain in which this organism is Eukarya. Eukarya, I'll talk about in the domain video, but for now, this represents all eukaryotes. So all eukaryotes will go into this category of domain, the one category of domain called Eukarya. And we know plants and animals all have eukaryote cells, okay, eukaryotes. And you learned about eukaryotic cells in one of the other chapters. So, and then we can go more specific into the kingdom. So what kingdom, which of the 6 kingdoms is this bear a part of? Animals, Animalia. Now, which phylum is he a part of? Chordata. Chordata is any animal that has legs and arms, okay? So the bear has legs and arms, so he's in that category of phylums. There are many phylums. Then we can go more specific. He is in Mammalia, the mammals that's one of the classes, one of the many classes there's possible. Then order, carnivore, that's one of the many orders there is. Then we have Uridae, one of the families, and so on until we have the Ursus. And then again, like I said, for the official name, we only use genus species, because imagine if scientists used this whole name, because technically this whole name would be accurate, but if scientists used this whole name, it'd be such a long name just to write polar bear. So normally they just consider the last 2, genus species, to write down the binomial system of classification. So they would just write Ursus Maritimus. Again, genus should be capital and species should be lowercase. That's what I did here. So now let's look at the tree. So if we look at the tree, it's going to start off similar, but it's going to change because it's not the same as a polar bear, right? So it's the same for the domain because it's a eukaryotic cell. Plants are eukaryotic cells. But then for kingdom, instead of being put in the animal one, it's going to be put into another one of the 6 kingdoms called Plantae. Okay, and then from there it keeps going until we name this specific species. Okay, now how about lion? So lion is also obviously an animal, so it's going to be eukaryote domain, one of the one domain that is called Eukarya because it's a eukaryotic cell, and it's going to be an animal. Just like the polar bear, it's going to have a chordata because it has limbs like legs and arms. It's going to be a mammal. It's going to be carnivore. It's going to now have a different family, okay? It's going to be given, so here is where at the family level is where the polar bear and the lion gets named differently, all the way down to species, okay? Now, what about the lion and the tiger? Where do they differ? So they're the same all the way down to here. So the Felidae, you notice how the lion for the family, it was a Felidae. That means a cat-like, right? We know a lion is a cat-like animal. So so is the tiger. So we call it cat, Felidae. But now they are going to be different in the species because for genus they are both Panthera. But so a lion and a tiger are so similar in names until the last one, which is species. So this is what I wanted to show, this naming, okay? It goes from general to specific, and that's all you need to know. Understand this concept. And this way you can see how different organisms are named differently and why they're named differently. But just know, in the next video, we will talk about domain and kingdom, and the video after that, phylum. So I hope this intro kind of helped you out and made things make a lot more sense, and now you understand the basics of classification of biodiversity.